Thank you. Good morning. So we're going to, given some of the talks I've seen, sort of take a slightly different track here. We're going to be talking about genetic data. As you mentioned, we launched AncestryDNA in May of 2012, and since then we started to acquire a lot of data. And I'll show you some of the data that we have. I'll talk to some of the challenges. Happy to answer some of the questions. This is obviously a pretty brief talk. There's a lot of really interesting data and science on the back end that leads to this. But I wanted to start off with something that we've been sort of really pushing lately, which is sort of the 2010 census ethnicity and sort of race document, right? And so this is what the U.S. government is putting out, saying, hey, what's your race, what's your ethnicity? You can see that there's a couple different areas for Hispanics and then for different races. I'm going to get back to this a little later, but I want to keep that in mind right now. So in terms of AncestryDNA, again, launched May 2012, we have probably the fastest growing database, certainly one of the fastest growing databases of genetic information. Here's where we dropped the price to $99. You see a nice inflection point, and when we put it on sale, the price elasticity is fantastic. So we now have over 500,000 genotyped samples, meaning we've actually acquired and actually analyzed the DNA. We also bank all of the DNA for the future. We think we'll be at a point where we'll have over 1 million samples, probably in early 2015, middle of 2015. And this is really a huge effort. There is no single database that contains this much information. So let me just take a step back, because if you haven't taken the product, it gives you a little perspective. So the product provides two different things. You give us a saliva sample, you send it to us, we send it to a lab in San Diego called Illumina. Illumina analyzes the data, uploads the raw data to our lab, or it's not really our lab, it's our offices in San Francisco where we have our data scientists, and they do all the analytics. And based on that simple saliva sample, what you get is two things. First is we predict your genetic ethnicity. So basically we predict based on your DNA content where your ancestors lived hundreds, perhaps thousands of years ago. It's actually fairly accurate, and I'll give you some data on that. And the second thing we do is we compare your DNA to everyone else in the database and give you who your genetic cousins are. So what you don't think about is most of the time you have like first cousins, some of you may know some second cousins. You have third, fourth, fifth cousins, and you have a lot of them, okay? Basically every generation, right, it increases dramatically. So you have on average like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 fifth cousins. Okay, and so in a database of 500,000, if you do the math, that's actually not that difficult to find many of your fourth and fifth cousins in the database. So here's just a very simple overview of what we give you with the prediction. We have 26 global regions right now. 3 years ago, right, the only thing we could tell you was that you were African, Asian, or European, and my joke was you need a mirror, not a genetic test, to do that, right? So I said, you've got to do better than that. And it's going to be really hard. I'm like, yeah, I know, but we've got to do better than that. So basically, like any problem, you have two things. Either you have more genetic diversity that you can assay that helps you separate populations, or you just collect a lot of data, and eventually, right, the bell curve gets a little taller, a little taller and thinner, and this is what you start to get. And so you really are starting to break populations now, even within Europe, which is one of the least diverse populations on the planet. And one of the things that I'm not going to talk a lot about, but we're communicating to lay consumers that don't have statistics and math backgrounds, right? We've got to be able to convey the probabilistic nature of what we're actually giving people, right? So when we say you're 25% Irish, we don't really mean 25.00%, right? There's a range. We do a lot of work in bootstrapping to make sure that we have a good range, but it's a range. So we try to do this, and we actually are constantly talking to the customer, trying to understand, did you properly understand what we're conveying to you? And then the matches are here. We basically compare you to everyone in the database. We show here's the match, here's the confidence, which is basically a positive predictive value or precision, which is what customers really seem to associate with. And then we have this old thing on the site that's a shaky leaf. And the shaky leaf basically says not only do we think that you're genetic cousins based on the genetics, but we also believe that by looking at both of your family trees on the website, we actually know who your common ancestor is. And when you do that, this is what you get. And in this particular case, you have a third great grandparents of these two customers that we've identified, and we actually tell you the path. So what we're trying to do, or starting to do, is really connect everyone in this database, both genetically and when there's family trees, with the family trees. And so, as I was saying with the genetic ethnicity, 26 global regions, we assay right now everyone's DNA at over 700,000 individual locations, or SNPs, if you're familiar with that terminology. So basically, these are areas in the genome that we know vary between human populations, and those are the ones that actually help us separate populations out, because we're all 99.9% identical, right? And so most of our genome isn't actually very helpful in actually discerning different populations. So let me just give you a quick example. Well, this is, before I do that, this is a distribution of the database. It's definitely biased. Ancestry.com has records primarily from the US, in the UK, Canada, Australia, et cetera. So the population is more biased towards Northern Europeans than it is a general population of the US. And so we see that in the genetics as well. What's kind of interesting, let me just give you a little sense again, if you haven't looked at how this data performs. One of the areas that's really interesting, particularly for African Americans, is when the records stop in the US, try to get some sense of where in Western Africa or where in the world they're from. And so Western Africa and Africa in general is the most diverse, genetically diverse populations, right? That's where out of Africa, that is the area that's had the most time to diverge. And so let me just show you briefly how we were able to get samples from Western Africa and actually create this ethnicity prediction. So I don't know how familiar you guys are with just a simple PCA plot, but what happens here is if you look at Benin here, you see that all of the people from that area cluster here. And as you move, you can follow the colors in Congo. You can see Ghana and Ivory Coast. You can see Mali. You can see Benin. And then you see Senegal. So basically, this is the genetic diversity that we see with, frankly, very few samples, but you're starting to parse out that genetic diversity, and what you're starting to see, some of you may have noticed, right, Nigeria already looks like it's breaking up into 2 different regions. There are 3 major tribes in Nigeria, and this is what's starting to happen. So as we collect more samples, you're naturally seeing sort of the samples sort of separate, and then we go back and figure out what is it in those samples that are distinct from the other populations. And so some people call this biogeographical. It's not just geography, it's religion, it's language, it's whatever held that group together is really what we're seeing here in the genetic profile. And so in terms of the data, remember that graph I showed you that looked pretty impressive of 500,000 samples? That's what we're looking at right here. This is the actual network effect that we're seeing with respect to cousins. So as the database has grown, we're seeing a quadratic growth in the number of DNA matches. And in fact, if you're of Northern European descent, on average, you have 54th cousins today if you were to take the test that we could identify, and on average, about 2/3 cousins, right? And this is constantly growing faster and faster. One of the biggest challenges we have is on the data computational side, right? Because what we have to do is now compare every day. Today, we are comparing another person that came into the database against 520,000 people. So it's 700,000 markers against 700,000 markers against 500,000 people. And it's always funny when you do the math, right? We have to QC the data to make sure something didn't happen in the lab where the plate rotates or whatever. Then we phase the DNA, and the phasing is basically we have to impute mathematically what DNA came from mom and dad. So that's an important part. We have to piece the data back together. Then we do the admixture, is how we call it in science, or the ethnicity prediction, and then we compare every single person to the database. All that has to happen in about 40 seconds, right? Because any more than that, you basically run out of time. We're selling 30 to 50,000 tests a month, so that has to be processed very fast. So this has actually been one of the most challenging parts of this, is actually keeping up with the network effect that we're seeing in the database growth. And so here's some fun data, right? So now we're doing a genetic census, right? So we say, okay, who has Finnish and Northwest Russian ethnicity, and where do they live in the United States? Like, where were they when they ordered the test? And we always joke is that people from Finland sort of definitely prefer the northern states. And then here are sort of just a simple wordle of the surnames that you see. European Jewish, you see heavy population in New York, very common surnames. Irish, like the stereotype, they really are mostly in Massachusetts, although we do see them in other areas. And they really are the Kellys and the O'Briens and Flynns. And then we see the African American population primarily in the Southeast. How does that compare to the US Census? And in some ways it's actually very consistent, right? So if you look at sort of Scandinavian, the census would suggest that most of the people with Scandinavian backgrounds are in the north, Irish more in the northeast, African American in the southeast, and then Hispanics. But what's really interesting is that most people self-identify very differently than what our genetics would predict. So for example, in Utah, I'm from Park City, Utah, we don't see the English particularly sticking out there. We see Scandinavian much, much broader than what people would self-identify with. And the Irish, people in the Northeast seem to believe that they're more Irish than they are. And then there's one interesting one, right? Like the census actually says American, which I'm like, what's that? I'm not really sure what that is, right? We've done a study, which I couldn't find the slide for this, but we've done one where we've looked at everyone's trees and said, how many generations out do you have to go to at least have one ancestor that wasn't born in the United States? And the reality is that I think it's like by 1900, it's like 98% of the people in our database who consider themselves American have at least one person that was born outside the United States. So I find this American pretty funny. And let me just show you something else. Here's what we call a pedigree view of ethnicity. So again, we have the advantage of having trees. So we actually look at the trees and say, okay, what was the birth location of people's trees? And these are ones that go back 10, 20 generations, some of our best customers. And what you see is the hot pink is the US, and as you would expect, there's been a lot of generations here in the US, but then you start seeing, the German immigration, you see a lot from sort of Scotland and Sweden, and then the English continues to grow, and not surprisingly in the 1500s, right? That was 1600s, that's mainly where it came from. But here's what people miss, right? This is what people see, and so they say mostly, English and American. But the reality is most people don't have every single line filled out. So if they did, right, here's what happens. You start filling out the line, and then at Ancestry you run out of documents, or you can't find the individual, and so people stop, right? They stop, but their ancestors didn't stop, right? So basically this white area here are ancestors that even our best customers have no idea where their ancestors came from, right? So they have this biased view because the documents say, here are your US relatives, right? We don't have documents in other places necessarily, so the bias is, well, I must be American, but in fact, you're really missing a whole lot of data, even the best ones, right? So I think the genetics is interesting, and we hear stories all the time where people say, I'm not German, and then they go back and look, and they're like, oh, my tree was so big. I mean, some people have 100,000 people in their trees. They're like, I forgot that I did have a bunch of German ancestors. And others are actually going back and trying to find different ancestors that may have come, because they'll just stop on a line, right? They have their favorite line of someone that's famous or whatever, right? And that's the only one they work on. And they've gone back. And so it's been really great. And so some of the other things we're finding is what we call hidden African or European ethnicity, right? So here's the proportion of Western Africa that we see in a set of customers. And this is a little older data, but the graph hasn't changed. You see this sort of interesting distribution, right? So we test a lot of celebrities. We have a show, Who Do You Think You Are, on TLC. So this is all public data. Blair Underwood, we had tested a couple years ago. He's, sort of average, if you will, for African American, about 70–80% African, but 20 to 25% European. And that's something that's really interesting. And you see on the Twitter and Facebook, a lot of African Americans taking the test saying, I didn't realize that I had European in me, right? And there was one great one that said, hey, I'm actually dark white, right? That was his comment. And I'm like, I love that, right? It's great, because so people are starting to understand through this genetic test, right, that they're actually more admixed or more mixed than they thought they were. Then you have Vanessa Williams as one of our sponsors. He's about 50% African American, or African, I should say. Blue eyes, we think it's from Finland, but haven't confirmed that. And then you have all these other, quote unquote, white people that have a small percentage of Western Africa. They look in the mirror, they don't see it, but it's there. And in fact, Henry Louis Gates published an article recently where as many as 13% of the whites in South Carolina have 1 or 2% of Western Africa, right? So we really got to start thinking about our backgrounds and ethnicity more than just what we see in the mirror, right? We tend to use skin color as the proxy for, what we believe ourselves to be, and it's very different. Corey is the last one. We just did some testing for America's Next Top Model. He was one of the contestants last year. He looks white, and he's basically about 50%. I mean, one of his parents is African American, right? And the point is, it's genetics. You don't inherit things exactly 50-50. Everyone thinks that you inherit it 50-50. The reality is you get half from mom and half from dad, but which half you get is completely random, right? And so this is a great question from my science team. So on the way to a talk, I gave a talk yesterday, and I very quickly on my iPhone say, hey, do we have an estimate of the percentages of Hispanics and African Americans in our database? Right? Not thinking runoff. And of course, what my team immediately says is, well, if we define African Americans as greater than 66%, then we have 30,388. I'm like, I stepped into this one, right? Like I knew this, right? This one's even better, right? If we define Hispanics as Americans plus European Iberian greater than 50, where neither Native American nor European Iberian is greater than 80%, we have 14,752. But of course, right, it's less clear because some Hispanics have a significant amount of European South, which is Italian. So I'm like, this is perfect. Guys, I couldn't even have asked for a better slide, right? Like, this is exactly what I wanted. But it shows, right, that such a simple question like, what's the African American percentage? What's the number of Hispanics? My team doesn't look at this data anymore, right? The same way that our sort of social constructs are, right? And so this is the data I get back. So this is great, and it makes it really complicated. I'm going to switch real briefly, and I'm going to get back to that. But the other thing we have is these networks, right? In 1790, there was 3.9 million people in the United States. Okay, and for all we talk about immigration has still been a small percentage of the population growth in this country, right? So when you really do, I've done this by subtracting immigration. I've done it by looking at average population growth. So the reality is that a lot of us today are descendants of these gateway ancestors that were here in 1790 when we first did our census, okay? And so what's happening is that we're now starting to connect people, not just we found a fourth cousin, but hey, we found 50 of you, right? And all 50 of you are descendants of the same ancestor, right? So here's a great one, right? This one, actually this data is old now, it's about twice this big. In this data, I think we have 400 customers that are all descendants from one ancestor, and here's what the actual genetic network looks like. And I'm not going to tell you who it is because we're going to publish this. And it's pretty funny. It's a pretty famous person. Immediately we knew the statistician who did this is from England, and he gives me the name, and he goes, I go, is it anyone famous? He's like, nah, some name. I'm like, okay. So you guys would all recognize it. We're going to try to publish this. Let me back up. Publish this soon. And by the way, I should just say, the people who formed these big clusters are the ones that were really fertile and really healthy, right? So these groups now had 12 or 13 kids. Almost all of them survived, and all of their kids had 12 or 13 kids, and all of them survived. So it's actually pretty straightforward. This isn't magic, right? So as the database grows, we're starting to see bigger and bigger networks of, politicians, senators, other famous people that were in the States a long time ago that had large families and are growing. So we're going to be starting publishing this. The last really fun thing here is that now that we have so many descendants of this couple, we have almost their entire genome represented in this cluster. So we are reconstructing the genome of these couples, and we're about 70% of the way there. So imagine that, right? It's going to be, hopefully in another 6 months or a year, as if they took our test, as if they'd gone to the website, spit in a tube, and sent me the test. And this couple, was alive in the 1700s, right? So what we're starting to do is, with enough descendants, everyone has a little piece of their DNA, and we put it together like a Lego set. So that's becoming really fun. So the other thing we did the other day was just looking at degrees of separation, right? So we always talk about 6 degrees of separation. This is how you get the whole Kevin Bacon game. And in our hands, if you've had a customer with U.S. roots, and you match against the database, you match to about half of 1% of everyone in the database. And then if we take those people and match them against the rest of the database, they match over 90% of the database. So basically, in 2 degrees, you basically can find a connection to almost everyone in our database, right? So the message here is that we are really connected. And true story, when I first started, we gave away 10,000 free tests because we need to get started, right? So we gave 10,000 free tests. We did all of the matching, as we call it. And the data came back, and I literally said, we have to stop. Something's clearly wrong. These people can't be as related as we think that they are. We redid everything, and in fact, we really are as related as we think we are. So, I mean, it's really kind of crazy. In fact, my team put this together. I don't think we have 200 people in the room, but the idea is given the probability that 2 people are fourth cousins, if there were 200 people in this room, the probability is about almost 98% that 2 of us are fourth cousins. So, I mean, this is the power of what we're starting to see with genetics now. And by the way, this is not, if you look at the statistics around our accuracy or our confidence around it, incredibly high. Fourth cousins in the mid-90s to high 90s in terms of our ability to accurately predict or precision, really a precision number is about 95%. So it's really, really powerful data. So I'm going to end with my own background. So this is my test. Hopefully you guys will take it and see what your backgrounds are. Pretty complicated. Definitely have Western African and African roots, Native American, this Italian, Greece, some of the European, and then Western. Anybody want to take a guess? I don't know if it's on, maybe already be on Facebook or something, but what's my background? Anybody want to guess? So this is what you get if your mom is Cuban and your dad's from the Middle East, right? So what people, again, remember the question with my team, what's Hispanic? Well, that's where I get the Western Africa and the Native American. And it's funny, right? Because if you ask my family, they're like, we're white Europeans, we never commingled with anyone. I'm like, yeah, sure you didn't. Yeah, and so it's funny, right? Because it's like, there was definitely some cute African American and cute Native American women that got into our gene pool, and then I'm one of the people that is more Italian than anything than Iberian. So go back to this, right? So how am I supposed to answer the census question at this point? A couple things. One, it wasn't until 2000, right, that we could actually allow anyone to put 2 races down. So as you can tell, I don't even like the word race. I struggle with even saying it just because as we continue to break, right, the different genetic components and really, divide people up, if you will, in some ways, the word race just seems sort of silly to me. But at least in 2000 was the first time you could do 2. I just put one definition down. It says black or African American, a person having origin in any, right, of the black racial groups in Africa, right? So there's not even like a significant amount. It's as if you have any. So here's what's really funny, right? Under my team's definition, I'm not even Hispanic, right? I'm fluent in Spanish. My mom was Cuban. I consider myself Hispanic, right? So my team unknowingly, right, didn't make me Hispanic. And what's really funny is under my team's definition, Vanessa Williams is not African American. Right? So is that right? Is it wrong? The whole point is it's a little bit arbitrary, right? And trying to actually put these labels on people is starting to get harder and harder as we actually start to get the data, the genetic data that underlies people. So I would consider myself Hispanic, but genetically, it's a little harder. Vanessa Williams, I think, would probably consider herself African American, but we have to recognize she's half European, and that's just the way it is. So, so I would hope, and one of our big pushes at AncestryDNA is as we're pushing this data out, we're going to try to get a talk at South by Southwest and just get people to understand that things are more complicated than they are. I would love it if we just drop the word race altogether and just acknowledge it, that we're just very similar and very connected, but at the same time there are things that separate us culturally and genetically. And so this is my team, and thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.